Welcome to the first TELedvisors webinar for 2018. So for those of you who haven't been before, the way these sessions generally work is we have 2 or 3 speakers. I'll talk for say 15 to 20 minutes on a topic to a theme, and then we sort of allow a little bit of time for just general Q&A. So you're more than welcome to ask your questions in the chat window, or turn your microphone on and talk to the room. So this session came about partially because of a talk that our first speaker, Karen Brack from Griffith, gave last year. One of our TELedvisors people was at that, and just thought it was a really interesting dive into the relationship that we have with students as advisors, learning designers, learning technologists. Obviously, these are people that we ultimately sort of are working for, but they're not necessarily people that are deeply involved in our day-to-day decision making. Our second speaker today is Meg Colasante from Trobe University. She's a lecturer in educational development, digital learning strategy in La Trobe Learning and Teaching. She's got more than 2 decades of teaching and academic development experience at RMIT University, and now she's enjoying a role as curriculum designer and TEL researcher at La Trobe. Are you ready to go, Meg?
Yes, thanks, Colin. Okay, so hi everyone. Great to see you all. As Colin introduced me, I won't dally because the time is moving on. I am speaking to you from Melbourne, so it's great to see people coming from all over the place from the chat area. Within today's presentation theme, I'm looking at tensions between staff conceptions and student perceptions of TEL, and I can see why the organisers chose to put Karen and I together, because there's a lot of relations between the tensions between what teachers think they're doing and what and the students' perceptions of. I'm going to present in 3 parts. I'll just press next, and it didn't go next. Let's try again. There we go, beautiful. So the first area is based on a presentation that I gave at Escalite last year in Toowoomba, and involves key tensions from a vocational education building and construction blended learning case. That's what most of my focus will be on, but if we've got time towards the end, I'll also give a quick overview of some undergraduate tensions, and there is some crossover between the two. Of course, they're both in the tertiary sector, and there's a few different cases that I can talk to if there's time, and then thinking ahead, what might we do with these various tensions into the future. So if we begin with the vocational education case. So as mentioned, this was based on a case that a paper that Kathy Vander Nelson and I wrote for Escalite 2017. The paper reports on a project within RMIT University, where Kathy and I used to both work, and on blended learning as a disruption in the vocational education building and construction program. So what is this project? Well, we were asked to evaluate a blended learning model implemented in a vocational school, specifically in the diploma of building and construction. Now, vocational education typically has mixed results with TEL, such as blended learning, and however, the building and construction industry is reportedly better than some other fields, and that's written up in a paper, for example, in 2015 by Callan et al. In the Journal of Vocational Education and Training. So these are people who are more likely to be receptive to TEL experiences. Over a space of 2 years, the building and construction teachers at RMIT redesigned 1/3 of their program to be into a blended learning model, and this are represented in the left-hand column, and the grey ones are the ones that had the blended learning redesign. and they're equivalent to about 600 hours, or about 1/3 of the program. And this compares to the orange, which is squished up in the bottom, which is all the remaining subjects. And initially the teachers believed that they were aiming for a flipped classroom model. They had attended a higher education presentation on flipped classroom model in the medical sciences at RMIT, and they were inspired and enthusiastic to change their teaching practices. However, they did decide to add lectures where they had not had lectures before, which somewhat confused the situation for the teachers and the students. So the lectures brought together several collections of student cohorts that were typically around about 30 students each into these big lecture halls to talk to them rather than interact with them, which is more what the students were used to. The online elements, as you can see, voice over PowerPoint presentation, quiz worksheets, additional resources, etc. While the remaining face-to-face element was split between the new lecture and and a reduction in time in the workshops and tutorials. And I say workshops or tutorials because it depended on the subject, whether it was kind of hands-on or group learning situations. So just a couple of notes I'll make before moving from this slide is there's two subjects that I've put a single asterisk at, and these are teachers who really tried to put the new model into place as it was planned. And then we've got, and this is what I found out through my research, and then the one with the double star, they had they cheekily booked some of their lecture time in the tutor rooms with multiple groups. And then the one with the 3 asterisks, they unfortunately had one cohort that went from Monday to Tuesday, and the Monday finished into the evening, so these students didn't actually have time to do the online work in between. So she chose to play the online materials like the video, the voice over PowerPoint presentation, and show the things in line in that class, and then that extended into her other classes too that didn't have that squished Monday to Tuesday option. So not even the teacher's own conceptions for how this was to play out was different amongst the teaching team, even though they knew what the base model was. So this is a question I asked at the ASCOLite conference, what is blended learning? And because of time, I might not pull out, get you to answer that, but say use the chat if you want to, or if you've got a burning definition you want to give, please interrupt me. But true to form, the answers tended to be framed primarily as the two modes, online and, yes, it is a huge question, online and face-to-face. But if you dig further, if you keep to people, or if you keep reading in the literature, you'll find that there's nearly always a clause such as this, but it's better if, or it depends. So Kathy and I considered, from our humble and collective years experience, that blended learning should be seamlessly designed in that it uses the best affordance of both face-to-face and online teaching and learning environments, and that they're designed to be complementary, that each is better because of the presence of the others. And then from that, another clause, what constitutes the best attributes of each mode depends on subject-specific context, such as learning outcomes, access to available technology and resources and things like that. Does anyone want to interrupt me with a counter position at this stage? Okay, I've got a software center message coming up which is blocking some of my controls here, so I'm just trying to get the chat to show. There we go. Now I can see it better. Okay, I'll move on. So what did we do? Well, I was approached by the school to evaluate their blended learning model because they're considering scale up to other disciplines across the school. So together with senior executives within the school, I designed a project to harness perspectives of the teachers and the students, as well as the EdTech support personnel. And this is using Rod Phillips and et al.'s 2012 Evaluating E-Learning framework, which turned out to be a really good tool because it reminded me to get the multiple perspectives and in multiple ways. So I had interviews, either group or individual, and questionnaire and demonstrations from both teachers, students and tech support people. They all were prepared to give me demonstrations. Then I added Engestrom's activity theory in a small way, specifically to include an abbreviated expansive learning component. So Kathy and I enacted this in the form of a workshop with the participating teachers to present back the aggregate iterative findings from the surveys and the interviews. So that's all the aggregate data from the teachers, the students, the tech support personnel. And this raised a number of tensions between what they believed they were doing and what the students' conceptions and what other people's perceptions were of the model. And from this, they discussed potential changes to the model. Then, continuing on into the same workshop, we showed the teachers the recommendations that Kathy and I proposed from our analysis. And this was in the form of a draft report, not yet handed in to the school. And much of the teachers' discussion on the data matched the ideas that we had generated. However, the main agree to disagree point amongst the teachers was whether to preserve the new lectures or not. The question from Tom there, had these students ever been a student in a blended learning course? I would probably suspect not. I think, you know, the enthusiasm come from the presentation that they saw of a flipped classroom model, which probably still contains some lectures but reduced lectures. And here they were, you know, thinking that, oh yes, some lectures are part of the model, and there was some confusion. They ended up changing their definition, terminology to blended learning. Yeah, I'm quite fond of this book. It's by Francine Glazier and she edited it on blended learning. And I particularly like her first authored chapter where she identifies seven characteristics that she found common in good practice examples of blended learning practice. So these characteristics are what Kathy and I used to sort and analyse the data in vivo. And this process we felt was important to take the data beyond a simple report that was requested from the school, to present the data in theoretical themes and to test and ultimately expand slightly on the Glazier blended learning framework. We actually found characteristics to be a robust framework with which to evaluate the intervention, and if interested, I recommend that you read at least that first chapter, which we abbreviate in our paper as well. So the findings. So across the data, there was little pedagogical reasoning provided for the blended learning model beyond initial enthusiasm. And I can see, you know, another comment there from Tom, you know, asking to be driving instructor when you've never driven or never been in a car or whatever. So the descriptions tended to rely on structural elements, and they're not always consistently presented by the various participants. Up on the screen, there's a composite representation based on the most common descriptions across the data. But then, even then, some students interviewed said, that's what they said is meant to happen, but it's not what happened like, it has not happened like that at all, not once. Noted that's from the Monday to Tuesday group. Another student from a different cohort gives a literal description, 2 classes in a week. The second one goes into the math part of it. That's more important to me. The first one is just like the introduction. And in the middle, we have this online lecture where you learn more detailed things. Active learning. Students indicated the tutorial workshops were the most interactive element in comparison to the lecture and online elements. Half the students in the questionnaire responded that they only passively reviewed the online resources. And of course, this goes back perhaps to what Karen said about students wanting to view twice the speed. It might be how they best learn. I'm not sure, but this was raised as a concern, that the passive viewing later in the workshops. Comparatively, a minor of activities including note-taking, completing the online quiz or assessment-related work was noted by some students. Some of the teachers were disappointed that the online resources weren't more active, and that's that quote on the screen there. Regarding time expansion, flexibility of when and ability to spend more time with the online resources was appreciated by almost all the student participants. Another quote to accompany the one on the screen is, "It provides a lot of information about the subject which can go over and over if you don't understand it, which in a lecture or class you might miss it or you might not understand it as much. Where at home it's online, you can go over and over it." There was one dissenting student questionnaire response on time expansion, and that was, "The nature of the lecture is that we are overworked to learn the flip resources before lectures. I attend the lectures and then go to the flip material to understand the lectures better." And that's an example that the teachers were still sometimes using the flipped classroom terminology, which translated down to the students. Regarding all students having a voice, the student voice tended to be more isolated in the online compared to the face-to-face learning elements. In the student questionnaire, a majority said there was no or limited communication with peers or teachers during the online learning, and there's an example there. And the final range of findings, so regarding face-to-face time being valuable, the range of mini-quote excerpts on display here are from the culminating teachers workshop where the aggregate data and draft recommendations were shared with the teachers. And across the student data, there tended to be more value placed on the tutorial or workshops compared to the lecture. In fact, they highly valued the former and more often complained about the latter. I've got a range of more quotes here, but I'll leave them for now. Most of the teachers interviewed were critical of the lectures. Even a pro-lecture teacher said that they had no other value than to introduce the topic and to create interest. Regarding learning responsibility and knowledge organisation, there were mixed student attitudes to the inherent increased responsibility, and the quote displayed is a positive example. A negative example is, "I know the aim of the vocational program is to do it in class and learn it in class, but instead of showing us how to do that, they're basically expecting us to figure it out. I'm basically having a problem with that." So this suggests to me that the scaffolds were not in place that the student expected to support their learning. Regarding subject layering, or what could be referred to more broadly as constructive alignment, there seemed to be more engagement than not about how the elements of the blended learning model related well to each other. And the quote here showing that they really needed to do the online work beforehand, otherwise they'd be stuck, illustrate. There were a few dissenting voices, such as in the student questionnaire. "You learn much less, good for people who work and can't attend class, not downloadable for future reference. In person you learn more rather than watching a video. Lecture is timetabled wrong and we just watch the video anyway." So, you know, the dissenting voices were fewer, but there's some strong arguments in that quote. Teacher presence was actually embedded in that last of Glazer's 7th characteristics, the student layering one. So we didn't initially code for this separately in NVivo, but it did become clear that we could only align very limited data to the sub or child node on teacher presence in the online part. And so there seemed to be teacher presence clearly noted in the face-to-face element, but very little in the online. So we coded that separately. And we decided that teacher presence needed to be an 8th characteristic of its own, so that it came out explicitly This is in order to give teacher presence more prominence as A, an aim within blended learning practice, and B, as an explicit theme of evaluation. And of course, those who are familiar with the works of Garrison, Anderson and Archer on teacher presence would possibly agree with that. What were from this vocational education case, what were the disruptions and tensions that the blended learning intervention caused? The tutorials or workshops were appreciated and certainly not new to vocational building teachers and students. Yet the time reduction still left a challenge that relied on students completing the online components. The new online learning element was largely appreciated for flexibility and access to learning, but was not as noted, needed to be more interactive. The online could have also been improved by adding some explicit socio-communicative role between the students and students to teachers. So what were the greater disruptions or tensions? The addition of the lecture seemed to be the most significant irritant to most students and teachers. And after 2 years of progressive implementation, most teachers didn't see the purpose of the lecture at the expense of the workshop tutorial time. Most interviewed believed that the lectures needed to go or to be reset to something different. The responsibility for learning was difficult for some students and literally stymied in some cohorts by A, timetabling the lecture tutorial too close together, and B, at least one teacher showing the online lessons in class, and C, of course, perennial problem, some students reportedly it didn't suit them, and it's hard to make things to suit everybody, of course. So sensible timetabling and extra supports, other than spoon feeding, not going down to those levels, for students could be a way forward. But I do want to make the point that overall, this was a dedicated bunch of actually award-winning teachers who were enthusiastic to embed digital learning into their teaching practice, and they did learn a lot in the process. So it was a real privilege talking to them. Now, time check, and because, and perhaps I'll ask my participants, all of you, whether you want to have a quick look at some common tensions in higher education and whether that should be brief or very brief if the answer is yes. So yes, no, or yes, if we have time. Okay, let's have a look. Shut me down if I'm taking it too long. Keep it brief, yeah. Okay. The higher education cases that I'm going to refer to very briefly all had the common TEL approach, that of a vocational sorry, I'm still talking from the previous one, from a video annotation tool called MAT, or Media Annotation Tool, designed and developed at RMIT. This image actually shows MAT use in a postgraduate Juris Doctorate program, but that doesn't matter. The tool's the same. And very briefly, MAT allowed for student active interaction with video by way of granular, convergent, purposeful video analysis, and also collaboration and feedback. So the tool's not the centre of the story, so I'll go to the next slide. The undergraduate cases, as indicated in my intro, are chiropractic, medical radiations, and 3 teacher cases, including 1 physical education. And there were various learning designs across the cases, and a very quick look at a couple represented, which are 2 very thorough designs, I must add, but they're represented simplistically in diagrammatic form here. And I will confess, from Karen's talk, there was no explicit student input into these designs, and they're based on years of scholarly teaching improvements and culminating in learning designs discussions with me as a curriculum designer. So the diagram here represents the physical education teacher education case and involves students recording their teaching in 2 episodes, analysing their teaching in small groups, receiving teacher feedback, writing a reflective report on their practice improvement across the semester. And another one from chiropractic, which involved granular analysis of a patient episode in 2 parts, where the students were increasingly responsible for setting the analysis categories to develop their clinical reasoning skills. So it's probably important to note that a minority of the undergraduate cases examined were not as thoroughly designed and could have perhaps benefited from the student input in the design process. But this is the slide we talk about the tensions. So this, first of all, these 4 things were found to be the common elements of student satisfaction. So the more of these things, 4 things that were in the design, the higher satisfaction was reported by the students. And capturing the student voice in interviews, including some observation and surveys, it became clear that, yeah, I said that. So the first factor may surprise some. The different perceptions in higher education is a question from Bill. I think they're related. I'll just run through a couple of them now, and you'll see that there's related, and of course the type of TEL that's used and whatever may make a difference too. So while the first one may surprise some people because, you know, the more sense of student control and timeliness in the analysis process should increase their satisfaction, it was a new tool, so there were sort of a few glitches to iron out, and like if the students uploaded their videos away from campus, it took them a long time. So the tension was that the student cost in time of a new tool versus not always explicit purpose benefits to this being clear for the students of using the tool. So why have I got to do this? Why is it taking me so long kind of nexus? And the second one, teacher feedback, of course, no surprise that that was a positive. But the tension here was that the teaching time it took to give feedback, even though the students really the feedback. For example, in medical radiations, one teacher gave every single student on every single annotation feedback, which was completely admirable, but certainly not sustainable for larger classes. And if we look at the next 2 together, because they're related, for both learner-to-learner interaction to achieve meaningful goals and formal assessment requirements, the tensions occurred if the students viewed the activities as busy work rather than meaningful online interactions or purposeful, constructively aligned assessment tasks. And this was where perhaps teachers got a little bit excited about the tool and sort of added on to the design rather than designing in and making the technology a bit more seamless. Yeah. So to come back to Bill with a difference, well, I think you'll see that there's some crossover, but difference because of the context. So thinking ahead, so the question I posed was, how can TELedvisors support teachers to examine tensions between staff conceptions and student perceptions of teacher-enhanced learning? And if I jump ahead to the almost final slide, some current research I'm doing was presenting again data back to teachers, and I found out that teachers had already faced a lot of tensions in change. They had to change their curriculum from within a teaching team from traditional face-to-face to blended learning, and there was a lot of tensions that they rose up to those challenges and faced them. And so the tensions that I presented were sort of minor in comparison. They're more like, this is what the students were doing. This is what their experiences were, this is what they're saying that they did and what they wanted to do, etc. And the thing that struck the biggest chord, if you like, was the less than expected student online interaction, which again relates back to Karen's talk and, you know, the expectations and the 2 times watching was something that the students did in this particular case, and also not responding to activities within videos within the discussion forum. So again, the discussion forum, is that the best tool? I buy into Karen's question about whether that's currently the best tool to use. I think I should shut up. There's only 2 minutes left. I'm gonna, yeah, I think others should talk.
Thank you, Meg. That was fantastic. If I could just get people to show their appreciation in the chat. And yeah, if anyone's got any quick questions. It did occur to me just now that maybe the thing for us to do would be to carry on the discussion in our discussion forum, but then Meg basically just trashed that idea. I think we the discussion ends pretty well, but I think also, yeah, the question about what students value, what value students get from discussion forums is really one that's worth looking at, because I mean, to me they seem incredibly useful, but yeah, if they're not being used, then why is that?
I think it depends on the task.
Yeah, and I think you're right. Yeah. Well, so for what it's worth, I put a link in the chat to the discussion forum. Otherwise, you can just find it in the TELedvisors site. If you're not already a member of TELedvisors, you're more than welcome to join. There's a link where you can create an account at teledvisors.net. Were there any? Can you see any questions in the chat that you wanted to respond to, Meg?
There was just a question from Bill. I think he had his hand up.
Oh, okay. If time allows, I realize we're wrapping up there, Colin. But I guess the key thing I'm wondering about around the tensions is, you know, if we include the student voice in design and we bring all that in, I'm just curious about what Colin mean to sort of close that loop, to get back to students and say, hey, listen, we learned, and this is why we're actually using this tool around educational video, or this is why we're ditching over reliance on forums, things like that. Because we ask a lot of students in terms of giving evaluation on an ongoing basis, but I know that one of the big tensions is they don't really feel like we're listening or hearing.
Yeah, I think that's a big point. 2 points actually. Closing the loop regarding getting students in the design process, also in the follow-up process too. Did this go as you thought it would, etc.? Because students might give what they think is good ideas, and then when it evolves, might not be exactly, you know, what they thought they wanted, and what they actually needed may not marry. And the other point is, I know that in at least 2 different universities, there's in the one has it in their learning management system, the other one has it in their student learning guide, a section where the teacher responds to how they've responded to prior student feedback in the surveys. And I think that that has great potential. I don't know whether it has wide effect, but it's certainly, I really like that idea, because it says to the students, hey, if you tell us stuff, we listen and we do something about it, but also we have done something about that in the past. So it helps them reframe what they're thinking too, because they might have a really good idea and it might already have been opposite to suggestions that other students had last time. So it might need to be worked into, evolved into something new again, rather than just going back a step. Yeah, so good points. Thanks, Bill.
I think that's probably a good point to end it on, and certainly something to think about a little more. So thanks everyone for coming along. This has been a fantastic turn up. We'll be holding these as we did last year on the 3rd Thursday of the month. If you're particularly interested in presenting or suggesting a topic, get in touch. And we'll catch you again soon. And thanks once more to Karen and to Meg.